In the year 303 AD, the Roman Empire descended into one of the darkest chapters in its long and brutal history. For nearly 3 centuries, Christianity had spread quietly across the empire, from humble gatherings in private homes to small congregations in cities and villages. But by the dawn of the 4th century, the faith had become too large, too visible, and far too dangerous for the emperors to ignore. Ruling jointly, Emperor Diocletian in the east and his co-emperor Maximian in the west forged a campaign of persecution designed not merely to suppress Christianity, but to crush it entirely. What unfolded was later remembered by terrified survivors as the Great Persecution, a systematic war against the followers of Christ. The edicts came swiftly, each one like a hammer blow. The first commanded that every Christian church be torn to the ground and their sacred writings, Gospels, letters, psalms, burned in public flames. The second declared that every bishop, priest, and deacon be hunted down and imprisoned. The third demanded freedom only for those willing to betray their God, to cast incense before the statues of Jupiter and Mars. And finally, the fourth decree extended that demand to every Christian in the empire: renounce your faith and live, or refuse, and face torture, torment, and death. What followed was not random violence, but a cold, calculated program of terror. Soldiers stormed sanctuaries and seized altars. Scriptures were stacked like kindling and set ablaze while the faithful wept in the streets. In marketplaces, Christians were dragged before magistrates and ordered to sacrifice. Those who refused were scourged until their flesh tore open, broken on the wheel, or fed to the flames. The empire that prided itself on law and order had declared war on its own citizens' souls. It was in this crucible of fire that one name rose above the rest, a bishop from a coastal city in central Italy, Formiae. His name was Erasmus. To his flock, he was a shepherd and protector, a man whose voice could make Scripture come alive, and whose presence gave hope in a time of unspeakable fear. To the Roman authorities, he was a symbol of dangerous defiance, a living reminder that the new faith could not be silenced by decree or destroyed by fire. The story of Saint Erasmus would not be one of quiet surrender. It would be carved in agony, written in blood, and remembered for centuries as a testament to a man who faced the full cruelty of Rome, and did not waver. Erasmus was born in the shadow of fear, sometime in the middle of the 3rd century, when Christianity was still treated as a dangerous superstition, an alien faith whispered in secret rooms, always under threat of discovery. From his earliest days, he knew what it meant to live under suspicion. He had seen families torn apart, fathers dragged in chains to execution, and mothers weeping over the ashes of loved ones burned alive for refusing to bow to the pagan gods of Rome. The boy grew up with the sounds of chains, the cries of martyrs, and the smell of smoke from sacrificial fires seared into his memory. This crucible forged his soul into iron. While other children dreamed of games, young Erasmus absorbed Scripture, memorizing the words of Christ with a mind both sharp and restless. He studied the Hebrew scrolls and the growing collection of Christian writings, learning from elders who carried their faith in whispers and scars. His heart burned with compassion for those who suffered, and yet his mind remained alert, cautious, shaped by the knowledge that following Christ often meant following him to death. As he matured, his gifts could not be ignored. Erasmus became known for a voice that could silence a crowd. His sermons were not dry words but living fire, explaining mysteries of heaven in a way even fishermen and merchants could understand. When he spoke of Christ's kingdom, people leaned forward, their eyes wide, as if they glimpsed another world beyond the cruelty of Rome. Pagans came out of curiosity, but many stayed, unable to resist the clarity and conviction of his words. By the late 3rd century, Erasmus rose to become Bishop of Formiae, a coastal city pulsing with life along the Great Appian Way. Formiae was no obscure village, it was a vital hub where traders, sailors, and Roman officials mingled, where news and rumors traveled swiftly through the empire. For a Christian leader, it was both opportunity and peril. Every sermon could reach souls far beyond Italy, yet every gathering risked attracting the watchful eyes of soldiers. Erasmus embraced both the risk and the responsibility. He guided his flock with the tenderness of a shepherd, ordaining priests and caring for the poor, but he also confronted the darkness of pagan Rome with unshakable boldness. His church became a beacon in central Italy, its light impossible to hide. And the brighter that light burned, the more dangerous it became. For in the eyes of the empire, Erasmus was no longer just a preacher. He was a threat. The rise of Christianity, once tolerated as a harmless sect, had become too visible, too threatening to the Roman order. Its growth unsettled priests of the old gods, generals of the legions, and politicians who depended on the sacred traditions of Rome to hold the empire together. At first, Emperor Diocletian seemed reluctant to unleash violence. For nearly 2 decades of his reign, Christians had known a fragile peace. Churches were built, congregations grew, and even some Roman officials dared to call themselves followers of Christ. But whispers in the imperial court turned tolerance into suspicion. His co-emperor, Galerius, a man bred on pagan fanaticism and urged on by a mother who was herself a priestess, fed Diocletian's fears. Each failure on the battlefield, each economic setback, each crack in Rome's once iron authority was blamed on the Christians. Then came the fateful omen. During a state sacrifice to the gods, pagan priests claimed they could not read the entrails of the animals. They accused Christians present of making the sign of the cross, polluting the ritual, and driving away divine favor. That accusation was the spark. Diocletian's patience snapped, and with the encouragement of Galerius, he issued the first of a series of savage edicts in 303 AD. Churches were to be razed, scriptures burned to ash. Christian leaders were to be arrested, chained, and publicly humiliated. And for ordinary believers, the choice was simple and merciless: bow to the Roman gods, or suffer the consequences. The persecution spread like fire across the empire, swift and merciless. Soldiers tore down sanctuaries stone by stone. Crowds gathered to watch sacred texts thrown into bonfires, their smoke curling into the night sky like a dark offering to the old gods. Families were ripped apart in marketplaces, children screaming as parents were dragged away. The machinery of Rome, once a source of law and order, had become an engine of terror. For Erasmus, Bishop of Formiae, the storm was unavoidable. His voice, his presence, his defiance, all of it made him a target. To the Roman authorities, he was not merely a preacher, he was a leader, a symbol of Christian resilience. Capturing him would break the community's spirit. Killing him would serve as a warning across Italy. Yet Erasmus chose not to surrender to their grasp. He could not allow the flock to be decapitated in a single stroke. With heavy heart, he made the unthinkable decision, to leave Formiae. Guided by whispers from allies, he slipped away under the cover of darkness, abandoning the coastal city that had been both his home and his battlefield. He turned his steps toward the mountains of Lebanon, remote, rugged, and unforgiving. There, amid caves and shadowed forests, he would wait. The mountains would become his refuge, his prison, and his crucible. Rome had declared war on his faith, and for Erasmus, the path ahead promised nothing but suffering, solitude, and a destiny drenched in blood. Erasmus vanished into the wilderness like a shadow swallowed by night. One day he was the shepherd of a thriving flock in Formiae, the next he was a fugitive, hunted by the empire's wrath. No longer did he walk the marble floors of a bishop's residence or speak before crowded marketplaces. Instead, he trudged through jagged ravines and snow-bitten passes, searching for shelter in the merciless mountains of Lebanon. Life in exile was brutal beyond imagination. Gone were the comforts of warm food, soft clothing, and the fellowship of believers. Each day was a struggle for survival, finding water trickling through rocks, scavenging roots and bitter plants, fashioning crude shelters from branches to fend off the cruel winter winds. The mountains themselves seemed like a living enemy, testing the limits of his body and spirit. Wolves prowled the forests. Blizzards sealed the paths. Hunger hollowed his cheeks. Yet Erasmus endured. In the silence of exile, he turned deeper into prayer. By flickering firelight, he whispered psalms into the night, his voice the only sound against the howling winds. He wrote letters on scraps of parchment carried by brave messengers who risked death to reach him. In those letters, he urged the faithful not to despair, not to betray their Lord for the sake of safety. His words, born of suffering, carried a power that sermons in the marketplace never could. Visions came to him in the solitude. He dreamed of angels cloaked in light, of Christ standing in the storm, of crosses rising from the mountains themselves. These visions, whether born of divine revelation or the delirium of hunger and cold, became his strength. They convinced him that his suffering was not wasted, that his exile was not cowardice but preparation. Each night he prayed not only for survival but for courage to endure whatever fate awaited him when Rome found him again. 7 years passed in this crucible. Erasmus entered the mountains a bishop, a man burdened with the duties of leadership. He emerged from them something far more dangerous to the empire, a mystic, a prophet, a symbol. His endurance became legend. Stories spread among Christian communities of the bishop who lived like Elijah in the wilderness, who survived storms and starvation, who received visions from heaven. To the faithful, he was proof that God's hand still guided his people, even in the empire's darkest hour. But such legends could not remain hidden forever. Rome still hunted him, and the mountains could not keep him safe forever. The exile had transformed Erasmus. The next time he faced the empire, he would no longer be merely a leader. He would be a living testament, prepared to embrace martyrdom itself. 7 long years had passed in the wilderness when Erasmus claimed he was visited by a vision so vivid, so terrifying, that it shattered the silence of his exile. In the blackness of his mountain cave, an angel appeared, radiant with a blinding light, its voice like thunder rolling across the peaks. The divine messenger spoke only one command: the time of hiding was over. Erasmus must leave the safety of the mountains and return to Formiae. It was a summons he dreaded, for he knew what awaited him in the city. Arrest, torture, and execution were not possibilities, they were certainties. Yet to Erasmus, the vision was undeniable. It was not madness brought on by hunger, nor feverish hallucination from solitude. To him, it was the will of God, a sacred order that no mortal fear could disobey. If Christ himself had embraced the cross, then so too must his servant embrace the fate prepared for him. And so, with a heart steeled by faith, Erasmus descended from the mountains. He traveled by night, slipping along forgotten paths, aided by a secret network of Christians who risked their lives to provide him food, shelter, and warnings of Roman patrols. Every step was haunted by the knowledge that he was marching toward certain death, yet he walked with the calm of a man already resigned to martyrdom. When he finally returned to Formiae, the reaction was as divided as it was intense. For the faithful, his reappearance was like a miracle. Their shepherd had come back from the wilderness, transformed into something greater, a living sign that God had not abandoned them. Mothers wept with joy, fathers knelt in reverence, children clung to his robe as if to a savior returned from the grave. But beneath the joy ran a current of dread, for all knew that his presence would draw the attention of Rome, and with it, the sword. Erasmus did not hide in the shadows. Instead, he stood boldly in the public squares, preaching with the fire of a man who had seen visions. He spoke of martyrdom not as a curse but as the highest calling, a privilege to suffer and die for the faith. His voice carried through the streets of Formiae, reminding the flock that though the empire's torments could wound the body, they could not touch the soul. His return brought both hope and fear. Hope that faith was stronger than Rome. Fear that the end was near, and the blood of many would soon follow. For the angel's command had set Erasmus on a path that could end only in chains, torture, and death. It did not take long for the empire to strike. One night, as the faithful gathered in secret to celebrate the Eucharist, the silence was shattered by the crash of doors and the glint of steel. Roman soldiers stormed the chamber, their torches casting wild shadows across the walls. Panic spread through the congregation, mothers clutching children, men raising trembling hands in prayer. At the center stood Erasmus. He did not run. He finished the blessing, placed the chalice gently on the altar, and surrendered himself to the soldiers. Dragged in chains before Emperor Diocletian, Erasmus faced the most powerful man in the empire. The emperor's voice was smooth, calculated, as he offered the bishop a choice. Sacrifice to the gods, Diocletian promised, and you shall have wealth, honor, and safety. Resist, and you will know suffering beyond imagination. But Erasmus, gaunt from years of exile yet unbroken, lifted his eyes and spoke with quiet defiance, I serve only Christ. No emperor, no god of stone, can command my soul. The words enraged Diocletian. What followed was a litany of torments. Erasmus was scourged with rods until his flesh split open, blood staining the marble floor. He was beaten with iron whips, his ribs cracked beneath the blows. Yet through every lash, he prayed aloud, his voice trembling but unyielding. The crowd, expecting screams, instead heard psalms echoing in the torture chamber. Then came the cauldron. A massive vessel filled with boiling oil was prepared, the steam rising like a foul mist. Guards forced Erasmus toward it, their faces hardened, though even they hesitated at the cruelty. He was stripped and plunged into the seething liquid. The crowd gasped as the oil bubbled and hissed. Many turned away, unable to watch. By all reason, the bishop should have died within moments, his body blistered beyond recognition. But the impossible happened. Erasmus stood within the cauldron, unharmed. His skin was untouched, his face serene, his lips moving in prayer. Gasps turned to cries of shock. Some soldiers dropped their weapons, others fell to their knees. Whispered words spread through the crowd, a miracle. Even among Diocletian's household, doubt flickered, and some secretly turned to Christ that very night. Humiliated, the emperor ordered Erasmus thrown into the darkest prison. Chains bound his wrists and ankles, guards stationed at every door. Yet in the midnight hours, light filled the cell. His bonds fell away, the iron doors swung open, and Erasmus walked into freedom once more. To his captors, it was inexplicable. To the faithful, it was proof, no power of Rome could silence a man chosen by God. Erasmus could have vanished after his escape. He could have fled deeper into the wilderness, hidden in distant lands, and lived out his days in obscurity. But he did not. Instead, he returned to the streets and villages, proclaiming the gospel with even greater fire. He spoke of Christ's kingdom with a voice sharpened by suffering, and the people listened as if the very heavens thundered through him. Whispers soon turned into testimonies. He healed the sick with his prayers, laid hands on the wounded, and gave hope to the despairing. One tale spread like wildfire, a story of a young man who had died suddenly in a nearby town. His grieving family, desperate, brought Erasmus to the body prepared for burial. Kneeling beside it, Erasmus prayed for hours. And then, before the astonished eyes of the household, the young man stirred, opened his eyes, and rose to his feet. To the faithful, it was nothing less than resurrection. The rumor spread beyond Formiae, crossing towns and villages, igniting hearts wherever it was told. Crowds grew larger each day, pressing close to hear the bishop who had survived boiling oil and prison chains, who now, it was said, could even call the dead back to life. For ordinary people, Erasmus was no longer just a bishop. He was a living miracle. But to the empire, he was something far more dangerous. Emperor Maximian, co-ruler of Rome, was already infamous for his cruelty. When news of Erasmus' growing influence reached him, he did not see a holy man, he saw a threat. To allow such defiance to spread unchecked would undermine imperial authority and mock the very power of Rome. Furious, Maximian demanded that Erasmus be captured alive and subjected to a punishment so horrifying it would silence the whispers of miracles forever. Thus, the emperor ordered the creation of a device never before seen in the empire, a wooden barrel lined with jagged iron spikes. It was crafted by Rome's finest executioners, each nail positioned to maximize suffering but not cause instant death. When the contraption was complete, Erasmus was seized and bound, forced into the spiked interior, and sealed within. Before a massive crowd, soldiers rolled the barrel to the edge of a steep mountain slope. The crowd hushed as the barrel began its descent. Each crash against the rock sent a chorus of metallic clatters and muffled groans echoing through the valley. People averted their eyes, certain that Erasmus would emerge as nothing more than shattered flesh. But when the barrel came to rest at the bottom, the lid was torn open, and gasps filled the air. Erasmus was alive. Bloodied, bruised, but conscious. He rose slowly, his lips still moving in prayer. Many in the crowd fell to their knees, convinced they had witnessed the power of God. For the empire, it was humiliation. For the faithful, it was proof, Rome could not kill what heaven had chosen to preserve. The miracles that preserved Erasmus again and again had become the empire's deepest humiliation. He had survived scourging, boiling oil, and even the spiked barrel hurled down the mountainside. Each time, instead of silencing him, his endurance turned him into living proof of divine power. Crowds whispered that Rome could wound flesh but could not conquer faith. Emperor Maximian, his cruelty already infamous, could no longer tolerate the defiance. He swore that this man would not leave the arena alive. For this, Maximian demanded a punishment beyond all others, one that would crush not only Erasmus but the spirit of every Christian who witnessed it. His engineers modified a windlass, a device normally used to haul ropes and stone, into an instrument of calculated horror. In place of rope, there would be human flesh. The message was clear: not even miracles could save a man from a death drawn out with such precision. On the appointed day, the square was packed. Roman officials, soldiers, pagans, and Christians alike crowded together, knowing they were about to see something unlike anything before. Torches flared against the midday gloom, casting long shadows across the execution platform. When Erasmus was led forward in chains, gaunt and scarred from years of torment, a hush fell over the crowd. Some stared with cruel anticipation, others with grief, but Erasmus himself stood upright, his eyes calm, as if he had already seen beyond the agony awaiting him. The executioners bound him tightly to the wooden table. With deliberate precision, they made the incision, fastening his body to the terrible machine. Gasps rose from the spectators, some unable to look, others transfixed by the merciless efficiency of Rome's cruelty. Then the windlass began to turn. Slowly, mechanically, the device pulled, each rotation dragging Erasmus deeper into torment. Cries rippled through the square, but not from Erasmus. His voice did not break into screams; instead, he prayed aloud, his words echoing above the noise. He prayed for his executioners, for the trembling crowd, for the Christians who would one day face trials of their own. His calm, his forgiveness, and his defiance in the face of unthinkable suffering unsettled even hardened soldiers. Some looked away, unable to watch. Hours passed. His strength waned, yet his prayers did not cease. Finally, as his body failed, his voice grew faint but clear enough for all to hear, gratitude for the privilege of suffering for Christ, and an exhortation for his flock to remain steadfast. When silence finally fell, Erasmus was gone. His death, meant to destroy faith, instead immortalized it. The empire had devised the cruelest of endings, but what remained in the memory of all who saw was not the machine of death, but the unbroken spirit of a man who chose eternity over compromise. The death of Erasmus was meant to terrify Christians into silence. Rome believed that the spectacle of his final torment, the windlass twisting relentlessly until his life was drained, would extinguish the faith he embodied. But the empire miscalculated. Instead of fear, Erasmus' martyrdom ignited a fire that spread from village to village, across cities and provinces. His name, whispered first in grief, soon rang out as a rallying cry of defiance. Stories of his unshakable courage traveled faster than the imperial edicts meant to erase them. Prisoners whispered his prayers in the dungeons. Families driven into hiding told their children of the bishop who prayed aloud even as death closed in. Traders carried the tale along Roman roads and over the seas, until the story of Erasmus reached every corner of the empire. Far from being forgotten, he became a symbol that no blade, no flame, no machine of cruelty could destroy. Within years, the Christian communities who had watched their churches burned and their leaders dragged to execution began to gather in his memory. They spoke of him not as a man broken by Rome but as one who had triumphed through suffering. His endurance was not merely admired, it was sanctified. Erasmus was no longer just a bishop of Formiae, he was now revered as a saint, a martyr who bore witness with his very body to the power of faith. In time, his iconography took shape. Medieval artists depicted him not with crown or scepter, but with the instrument of his death, the windlass. In paintings, manuscripts, and sculptures, the strange device became a chilling yet powerful emblem of victory through torment. To the faithful, the sight of the machine that once mocked him now proclaimed the triumph of God's strength over human cruelty. His image became a reminder that suffering for Christ was not defeat but eternal glory. Particularly among sailors and fishermen, Erasmus' legend took root with special devotion. The rigging and winches of their ships reminded them of the windlass of his execution, and so they turned to him as their protector. When storms battered their vessels and waves threatened to drag them into the abyss, they called upon Saint Erasmus, trusting that the man who had endured Rome's cruelties could intercede for them against the wrath of the sea. Thus, the empire that had sought to erase him only secured his immortality. From the blood-soaked square of his death rose a legacy that crossed centuries. Erasmus of Formiae, torn by Rome's hand, was reborn in memory as Saint Erasmus, the martyr whose agony became a beacon, and whose silence in death thundered louder than any emperor's decree. Centuries passed, and empires rose and fell, yet the name of Erasmus refused to vanish. Rome, with all its legions, its marble, and its cruelty, collapsed into dust. The emperors who mocked Christ and sought to break his followers became little more than footnotes in crumbling histories. But the memory of a single bishop, dragged through torture, broken by no device, silenced only by death, endured. His death became not an ending, but a seed planted deep within the soil of Christian faith. For generations, his story was told not in the language of defeat, but of victory. The windlass, once a symbol of Rome's cold ingenuity, transformed into a sacred emblem of faith unyielding. Artists in the Middle Ages carved it into stone and painted it onto vellum, not as an object of terror, but as a testimony of divine strength. To look upon the image was to be reminded of what one man could endure when sustained by belief in something greater than death. As Europe reshaped itself, as kingdoms rose where Rome once ruled, the name of Saint Erasmus was invoked at sea, in churches, and on battlefields. Sailors cried out to him when storms battered their ships. Fishermen carried his image into the waves, believing that the man who had endured the empire's wrath could surely shield them from the sea's fury. To the sick, he was remembered as a healer. To the persecuted, he was a companion in suffering. To the faithful, he was proof that no earthly power could crush the spirit. His legacy endured precisely because it was soaked in blood and bound in iron. It was not polished or softened, it was brutal, chilling, unforgettable. For Christians across centuries, Erasmus was not a distant saint lost in gilded legend, but a man whose agony mirrored their own trials, whose endurance gave meaning to their pain. He became a mirror of the eternal struggle between earthly tyranny and spiritual conviction. And so, long after the windlass rotted, long after the empire crumbled, long after the names of his tormentors were forgotten, Saint Erasmus remained. His memory lived in candlelit chapels, in the salt-stained prayers of sailors, in the trembling voices of the persecuted who clung to his story as a lifeline. His death, once staged to break faith forever, became a banner that faith would carry through the centuries. The Romans sought to erase him, but they carved his memory into history instead. The Bishop of Formiae, torn by cruelty, emerged immortal. His agony became his triumph. His silence in death became a voice louder than Rome itself, a voice that still whispers through the centuries, that conviction can outlast empires, and that faith can turn torment into eternal glory.